The story of human civilization is one that's evolved over millennia, from developing the ability to work with tools to the development of artificial intelligence in recent decades. This evolution of human society would accelerate in the 20th century, resulting in significant changes in science and geopolitics. Empires rose and fell, and their leaders would propagate the ideologies that would forever alter the societal landscape. Join us as we reflect on the legacy of the 20th century. Let's see how pivotal this century really was. But before delving into the 20th century, let's start by laying out the geopolitical and economic backdrop. The prior century had seen key events unfold, such as the abolition of slavery around the world. The Napoleonic Wars had been fought, and with Napoleon defeated, Britain had become an even stronger global power with a more extensive trade network. The 19th century would also see the emergence of European imperialism and colonization in much of Asia and Africa. Over in the East, the Ottoman Empire had experienced substantial decline as a result of unending conflicts and a substantial debt burden. Its decline would also be accelerated by countries such as Greece and Serbia breaking away from the empire. Across the pond, America had seen significant land expansion at the start of the 19th century with the purchase of Alaska from Russia and later on, Louisiana from the French. America was also in the process of recovery after fighting a 4-year brutal civil war in which the Union emerged victorious, leading to the strengthening of the American hegemony by the start of the 20th century. With as much as a quarter of the world's landmass and population under its control, Britain had become the world's largest superpower, reaching its peak at the end of the First World War. The First World War, or the Great War as it's also known, officially started in 1914 after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But before his assassination, tensions had been brewing in Europe for decades, going as far back as the defeat of France and Russia in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War. Fearing the rise of Germany, which was aligned with Austria-Hungary and Italy, France would ally itself with Russia. As a result of the power void left by the defeat of the Ottomans at the end of the Balkan Wars, the alliance between Austria-Hungary and Germany would be strengthened. The First World War would lead to pivotal technological and medical advances, but perhaps its greatest legacy would be its role in causing the Second World War, despite it being called the War to End All Wars. You see, the First World War had ended with the Allied forces forcing Germany to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This essentially placed the blame on Germany, which had been forced into paying reparations and had also had restrictions put on its military expansion. In the lead up to the Second World War, a certain Adolf would exploit the humiliation of the Germans in riling its citizens against the Allied forces. His rise to power has been detailed in other videos, so please check those out. However, he was just one of many authoritarians taking central stage in the 20th century. You see, human civilization has had long-standing relationships with tyrannical leadership. And well, the 20th century was no different. With the consolidation of new nation-states around the world, and with new technological military advancements, authoritarians were stronger than ever. They could inflict damage on their people, as well as abroad. This is well exemplified by the rise of fascism in the 20th century. Fascism, an ideology which combined the extremist aspects of authoritarianism with ultra-nationalism, gained prominence in the interwar years. First in Italy, with Mussolini's rise to power, before spreading to other parts of Europe. These movements were anti-democratic and its proponents preferred strong, in inverted commas, leadership. During both wars, significant advancements had been made in the field of science and technology as the competing powers strove to gain an advantage on the battlefield. Key discoveries include penicillin, vaccines, the computer, and radar technology. The post-war period will see the emergence of two competing superpowers. On the one hand, you had the capitalist and democratic United States and its allies. On the other hand, the communist Soviet Union and its allies. And while there was no fighting between both blocs, what you did see was a series of ideological confrontations epitomized by the nuclear arms race and the space race in what came to be known as the Cold War. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union, would be the first man in space. A few years later, the Americans would get one up on the Soviets by landing the first man on the moon. The Cold War would eventually end with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Post-war Europe found itself having to rebuild much of its infrastructure after the decimation of much of its cities and economies. And this is where the rise of an emergent superpower comes in. In 1947, the US Secretary of State gave a speech to the graduating class of Harvard University calling for a comprehensive program to rebuild Europe. In 1948, Congress approved the funding, and over the next 4 years, America would provide roughly $13 billion of aid to support the rebuilding of Europe under a program come to be known as the Marshall Plan. As part of its rebuilding efforts, Britain would recruit workers, often coming from the Commonwealth nations in South Asia and the West Indies. The arrival of immigrants were often met with racist backlash and the occasional race riots. In subsequent decades, minority groups would fight for their civil rights in Britain. This fight for civil rights echoed that which existed in America in the same period. In their struggle for equality, African Americans would stage peaceful demonstrations to force constitutional change. Key events include the decision to desegregate schools in Brown v. Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycotts, and the I Have a Dream speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the same light, many countries which found themselves under British colonial rule began to fight back in the struggle for independence. This would often lead to violent confrontations with their colonial administrators. The 60s to the 80s would see countries gain independence from the European overlords. In Germany, the Berlin Wall, which had become a symbol of the ideological division of the Cold War, would crumble in 1989, paving the way for the unification of Germany a year later. This would in turn trigger the swift collapse of the Eastern European regimes, and after the resignation of Gorbachev in 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. With this came a pledge from both sides, that is, the capitalist West and the communist East, to reduce their nuclear arsenals in the following decade. The post-war period had seen a gradual integration of Europe, taking different forms and names in the preceding decades. The European Union was formally created in 1993. With the goal to enhance economic and political integration, it created a unifying currency known as the euro and granted unified common citizenship to individuals in its member states. One of the cornerstones for the EU was the adoption of democracy, and while there have been controversies relating to the democratic legitimacy of the Union, the impact of the new geopolitical order on economic growth in Europe and the world at large is hard to overstate. The United Nations was another organization formed in the aftermath of the Second World War. With the stated aim of preventing future world wars, it replaced the unsuccessful League of Nations. Some key actions by the United Nations include the partitioning of territories in the Middle East in the 1940s, and also in 2015, the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. The 20th century was marked by significant progress on many fronts. From the field of science to political science, more advances were made in this century than in all of the world's prior history. 24 years into the 21st century, we are yet to fully understand the impacts of the changes that took place in the 20th century. But what has become apparent in recent years, especially with the decline of democracy, is the need for a continual fight to ensure that the institutions built in the preceding century continue to shape the modern world for the better. Otherwise, we are stuck in an endless cycle in which, according to Plato, aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, and then democracy and then tyranny again becomes the norm.